take the rate of immigration to the level of economic growth so that people can assimilate that. And it can't happen so fast that it overwhelms the cultures of the places where people go. So we have to be open, but we have to be open in an orderly and intelligent way. Adam Garfield, I'm the editor of the magazine. What is NPS? Monterey. Let me tell you a story. This is last 8 minutes. Back in the intelligent people knew this problem over the future. Essentially, slavery. One of my heroes there, figure out a way. Put it off for a while. But in any event, that's my fault. Nobody ever calls me. My son. Okay. What's up? If you come by after 5:45. Okay, well, I mean, I'm going to see it. Yeah, sure. If you can hear me from outside, please file in if you'd like to hear the great Francis Fukuyama beamed in from Palo Alto, California in high definition. We FedExed a camera to him, especially a couple of days ago, so we hope this works well. And if there's a technical glitch and we can't hear him or anything like that, you'll have to listen to me for a few minutes, and then we'll do a round robin of our existing speakers, or we'll call up staff members of the American Interest in the audience to say a few words, something like that. Anyway, Frank, are you there?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Terrific. Yeah, wonderful. Frank, what are you waiting for? Start.
Oh, was that the introduction? Oh, okay. Sorry.
I'm not going to introduce you. First of all, everybody knows who you are, and you can introduce yourself, or would you like me to introduce? I'll introduce you a little bit. Okay. All right. So, as I said in the beginning of the first half of the program, then the idea for this event goes back to a 2011 issue that we published which is not on the screens, Frank, because you're on the screens now. Are Plutocrats drowning the Republic? And we heard first from Tyler Cowen as the first segment, then from Jeffrey Winters, and then Nils Gilman, all drawing off their previous articles in earlier issues. You were quoted, Frank, by Nils Gilman at length in his final brilliant segment, quoted from the article in the 2011 issue that we're retro-viewing. Frank, what else should I say about that?
No, that's fine. All right, I'm ready.
You ready to roll? Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, well, thank you for that introduction, and I'm very sorry not to be there in person. We teach a program, a summer fellows program here at Stanford for democracy activists around the world, and we're kind of in the middle of that, which is why I could not get to Washington, and I'm sorry I missed the earlier presentations. Also, I cannot see any of you, even though presumably you can see me, so when you giggle and snigger and roll your eyes, I'm not going to be able to catch that. Okay. Here we go. All right, very good. So I can see a bit. So actually, this retrospective on that 2011 issue was quite interesting because I had actually completely forgotten that I had written that article. And so it was actually quite interesting to reread it at this 5-year juncture. And so I would just summarize a little bit of what I was saying back at that point. That first of all, the first part was simply to establish the fact that we had a big problem with inequality. I quoted this study of Piketty and Saez, which was published, before Piketty's big book on capital in 21st century, and then reciting what have now become fairly, quoted facts and figures about growing inequality. From my standpoint, the bigger problem that this posed was not the economic dimension, but was the political problem of representation. You have the Madisonian view that you're going to have factions in the United States and American democracy. Madison's idea was that these factions would, in a large and diverse country, essentially cancel each other out. His major concern was over excessive centralized government authority, basically tyranny, and the worry was really that one of the factions would grab the government and then use that power to tyrannize over the rest. The problem, I think, in the United States today is a little bit different from that. We do have a crisis of representation. The theory that collectively interest groups in American democracy somehow represent the democratic public, I think really doesn't hold up in many ways because of the outsized influence that money plays in American politics. And so some groups are better represented than others. Some have much more influence over the political system, and indeed some individuals have much more influence than they should in a system that is based on one man, one vote. Now, it is true that, Madison's hope that these groups would cancel each other out to some extent has been correct, that we do not have a tyranny of over-centralized government in the United States. The problem is, in my view, rather different, that the constitutional system established by the Founding Fathers, this complex system of checks and balances that we have, really to a much greater extent than most parliamentary democratic systems, privileges minorities. It allows minorities to block action by majorities. This is done deliberately. Again, this is a safeguard against excessively strong centralized government. But when you combine this with a degree of polarization in American society, and with these extremely well-resourced and well-organized interest groups, you get this phenomenon that I labeled Vetocracy, in which the problem, in a way, is the opposite of what Madison was concerned about. It's not overly centralized government. It's actually government that can't do anything. It can't make basic decisions because it's too easy to veto individual things that hurt the interest of one of these particular groups. I would say prima facie evidence of this is Congress's inability over the last decade to pass a budget. I mean, they haven't passed a budget under so-called regular order now for a number of years running, and in several of those years you actually had to have a major crisis threaten America's credibility as a in terms of sovereign debt, shut down the government in one case, simply to do what a well-functioning political system ought to do, which is to pass a budget regularly every year. And there are many other aspects of American policy where Vetocracy operates. That's the reason we can't build infrastructure or undertake important decisions on immigration or guns or any number of other topics. Now, the title of that 2011 article was left out, and the big question that I posed in the article was, given the fact that you had this increasing degree of economic inequality, this overrepresentation of the well-organized and the well-to-do in the political system, why didn't you have more populism? At that point, you had Occupy Wall Street and you had the origins of the Tea Party, but given the magnitude of what had happened in the United States, the socioeconomic changes, you would have expected an upwelling of populism, and particularly on the left, because the crisis, the subprime crisis in 2008, 2009, really was the result of policies that the deregulatory policies that had led to the accumulation of debt in the banking system, and that I thought in that article was a interesting conundrum. So we fast forward to 5 years later and ask what's changed, and so I would say there's basically 5 things that now in hindsight are different. The first is, I think the fact of inequality is no longer challenged, either on the left or the right. I think still in 2011, this idea that that there had been actually this big middle class stagnation, and then a lot of the working class falling off the cliff in terms of incomes was not readily accepted by a lot of people on the right. But now I think that even someone like Ted Cruz admits that this is happening. Second, I don't think that the issue of skewed representation as a result of that inequality is also really contested. And if you actually listen to a lot of the rhetoric, both on the left and the right, it has to do with lobbyists and money in politics, and the fact that ordinary Americans feel that they are not adequately represented in a system in which money and a layer of oligarchs plays such an important role. The third kind of obvious difference is now there is a left-wing populist movement in the form of the people that voted for Bernie Sanders, which I think have been quite unanticipated, as little as a year ago. So I can say that, I was actually anticipating. I mean, that was what my article was about. Why was there no Bernie Sanders arising on the left to thunder against Wall Street and argue that, they had rolled over all these little people and the like, and now we have it. But the fourth really big change is the way that the right-wing populist movement has metastasized, in my view, and grown into something much bigger and much more powerful, I think, than the way the Tea Party looked back in 2011, where it's kind of the thing that's been reshaping American politics. But, to be fair, the populist movements have come from both the left and the right. And so now the question, the promise of that article has now been fulfilled. We are now landed with populism. So the question then becomes, there's some important questions, about that evolution over the last 5 years, and then finally some questions of what's going to happen in the future. So the first issue has to do with the left-wing populism. Despite the fact that Bernie Sanders made such a great showing and actually, I guess, managed to raise more money in the primary season than Hillary did, it is still, I think, the case that left-wing populism is less powerful and less organized. And it's not just because Hillary won the primary. I think overall it represents, a less broad segment of the American public than the right-wing version does. Now, I think that this is part of a larger phenomenon having to do with the weakness of the left everywhere. In fact, apart from certain parts of Latin America, I don't think the left has been strong in any region of the world. This is particularly true in other developed democratic countries. So European social democracy, that had really been the architect of the post-war European welfare state, has disappeared as a major pillar of stability in country after country. The German Social Democrats are a shadow of their old selves. The British Labour Party is now in the midst of a huge labor fight that reflects the fact that its base has largely defected, to the right. In France, the socialists are completely adrift. Again, their base has been eaten away by the National Front and by right-wing populist parties. The working class voters that used to vote reliably either for communists or socialists vote in a very different way. And beyond the electoral weakness, there's also, I think, a more fundamental issue, which is the Democratic left doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't really have a clear-cut agenda, because I don't think the redistributionist welfare state ideal that animated it in the 50s and 60s as those welfare states were being built up is something that still people really believe is a reasonable agenda. And one demonstration of that is every time the French socialists have tried to do something along those lines, they get hit by economic reality and then immediately have to retreat. It's happened to Mitterrand, and it happened to François Hollande, and so forth. I think Bernie Sanders can get away with, calling for a kind of, he's sort of an unreconstructed democratic socialist from the 1960s. And he can get away with these kinds of old-fashioned calls for redistribution, because I think most of the people supporting him are just too young. They're all born after the Berlin Wall fell, and none of them remember what either real socialism looked like or what democratic socialism ended up looking like in a lot of Europe by the 1970s and 80s. And so, maybe there's hope just in the fact that people are going to forget about what socialism was, and the same ideas will start coming back. But I do think that the absence of a very trenchant and clear-cut left-wing agenda has been really hampering them. The bigger and more pressing question really has to do with why right-wing populism has taken off in a way that left-wing populism has not. The answer to this, I think, is both similar and different in different democracies, but there is a common thread. So I think the issue in the United States really does come directly out of the increased inequality, and it has to do with the way that Americans have thought about inequality. The biggest losers from all of the technological immigration, globalization changes that have occurred in the United States over the preceding, generation, or more than a generation now, has really been the old, white working class. I think this is pretty commonly recognized. This is the, core of Trump's support. I suspect in November he's going to steal away an awful lot of the rank and file union vote in industrialized states that used to go pretty reliably to Democratic candidates. And one big issue is, why did these people vote for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s but are now voting for Donald Trump in the 2010s? And that, I think, is interrelated to the other big problem with the left, which has to do with identity politics. That, for at least the last generation, the agenda of the left, I mean, it's not just that they didn't have a coherent economic agenda, but economics dropped off the table for them almost entirely in favor of different varieties of identity politics, meaning, gender, feminism, race, ethnicity, gay rights, and environmentalism isn't exactly a form of identity politics, but it is something favored by a particular social identity out there in the American population. And the only identity which the left really could not relate to terribly effectively were working class whites, because I think for cultural reasons, having to do with patriotism and, traditional family values, religion, guns being quite important in this country, the Democratic Party simply lost touch with them. And therefore, they had been aligned and voting for Republican candidates that completely had an agenda completely contrary to their interests. That, the Paul Ryan, Ronald Reagan type of Democrat who's in favor of immigration and free trade and globalization, which also reflects the interests of the, the donor class and all the corporate supporters of the Republican Party, basically were exposing these same workers to ruthless technological and international competition, and at the same time trying to erode the social safety net that had supported them, ever since the New Deal, and therefore, that was a time bomb within the Republican Party that was waiting to happen, and along comes Donald Trump, and the time bomb has now gone off. Race and ethnicity really, I think, are an important component of this, because, so there was always this question of American exceptionalism. Why did the white working class never act the way the European white working class voted? This gets back to this age-old question of why no socialism in the United States. And so the standard answers to that, given by people like Seymour Martin Lipset, and Louis Hartz and people coming from that tradition, had to do with a greater degree of economic mobility, classically, or at least the perception of greater economic mobility in the United States. So everybody was a Lockean liberal that believed that even if they were poor, their children would be, potentially rich. So that's part of it. But race also has a lot to do with it, because the white working class, I mean, this is particularly true in the South, but it was true in other parts of the country as well, never regarded themselves as being at the bottom of the economic pyramid. That you always had African Americans, and then in more recent years, Hispanic immigrants, that were occupying the menial positions that white workers used to do, but now we're no longer doing. And the fear, and so the opposition, I think, to some of the redistributionist policies really had to do with the fact that the perception was that they were not aimed at formerly working class people that thought of themselves as middle class and were now falling to the bottom of the economic pyramid, that all the redistributionist policies were aimed at people of a different race and ethnicity who formed a layer below them, and their fear was being sucked into that lowest layer. This may also explain some of what's going on in Europe, because classically, before high levels of immigration into Europe, the white working class was all there was. They were at the bottom of the pyramid. And so, of course, they favored redistribution, from rich to poor, because they would stand to be the biggest beneficiaries. But now, a lot of Europe, much more resembles the United States. You've had, more than a generation, high levels of immigration of people who are culturally and racially and ethnically different from the majority populations. And you hear the same kind of rhetoric in the European debate over immigration, that these immigrants are coming to steal our welfare benefits, meaning that, redistributionist policies meant to benefit the lowest stratum, which at one time had been the white working class, were now going to go to other people. So Samuel Huntington, my mentor, used to say that the most politically destabilizing stratum in any society were not the poor, because they're too disorganized and atomized really to organize terribly well. It's always people that are either middle class or think that they should be middle class and who are losing status, that have enough resources to organize, can get angry about that loss of status, and the perceived loss of status is more important than your absolute level of income and security. And so I think that kind of explains why a lot of the thunder that had gone to the left is now gone to the right. And by the way, it's very interesting if you compare the left-wing populism of the 1930s with the left-wing populism today. Franklin wrote, there's a Ira Katznelson has written a very nice book on the New Deal called Fear Itself, and it's useful to reread that or to relearn the history of that, because his clientele, things like the TVA were directly aimed at poor whites in the South. The Tennessee Valley Authority in Muscle Shoals, Alabama, was dealing exactly with those white populations. And if you look at the voting records, because of this race issue, because blacks at that point were not part of the Democratic coalition, or not important parts of the Democratic coalition, poor rural whites in the South were voting, 90% of them were voting for the Democratic Party, for welfare state, redistributionist parties, and now these people are all, committed red state voters. And so that kind of is a reflection of the, the social transformations that have happened in the future. So, what does this mean for the future? I think that, in a certain sense, the fears that we had, or I had, frankly, a year ago, that money was playing too big a role in American politics are, in a certain sense, overblown, because I think both the Trump candidacy and the Sanders, insurgency prove that actually these wealthy donors cannot simply determine the outcome of American elections, and that the system is actually now responding, because essentially that class of white working class voters had not been adequately represented by either party, by the Democrats or the Republicans. And so now they've got a champion and they're finding their voice, and I predict they're not going to go away. They're not, even if the Republicans lose big in November, I don't think that group, once mobilized, is going to go away. Quite frankly, I don't think Donald Trump is going to go away either if he loses. And so that's going to be a permanent feature, which is going to, it's certainly directly going to affect the fate of the Republican Party, because the kinds of policies favored by the elites, which had been supported by these working class voters, are just not going to, they're not going to cut it anymore. It is hopeful in the sense that, it means that democracy in the United States is working in some sense. The system is finally responding to, these real social changes. The only problem is that you need leadership. And you need to be able to mobilize, that populist anger in favor of policies that will actually help their situation rather than make it worse. And I think virtually everything that Donald Trump has advocated is actually going to make their situation worse. He still wants to cut taxes on rich Americans. He does want to keep, a lot of the safety net in place, which is an important break from Republican orthodoxy, but, essentially starting a trade war, based on this kind of narrow nationalism, economic nationalism, is in the end not going to bring back any of those manufacturing jobs that he's promised. But there will be opportunities for a kind of new generation of politicians playing in this very different. It's a different social space, and now it's going to be a completely reordered political space. And I think that that does provide opportunities for political entrepreneurship. So far the entrepreneurship we've had has steered things in the wrong direction. By the way, this is a good indication of why leadership is really important. The United States, I think, was really lucky in the 1930s. You had right-wing populists at that time as well, and Roosevelt basically undercut all of them. He undercut the populism both from the communist left and also from the right wing, the Father McCauflins and so forth, because he actually appropriated part of their agenda. I mean, if you look at all the fascist architecture in Washington, D.C., it's kind of it is sort of a borrowing from the popular forms of fascism that existed at that time, but he kept it within democratic bounds. And it's not too late for, somebody to craft a policy of that sort now, which I think, the way I would put it is it has to be based on a kind of moderate understanding of national identity, an acceptance of the fact that we are organized as a nation that does put, our citizens ahead of other people and judges things by that, but is not exclusivist, remains liberal and open to the world both economically and culturally. And so it means, in a certain sense, backing away from this headlong embrace of globalization. I actually think that you could change immigration policy in quite a number of ways that would ease some of the concerns that people have had about immigration, and yet keep America connected to the rest of the world in terms of foreign policy, in terms of support for other democratic countries around the world, and the like. So that's it. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm really sorry I'm not going to be there at the reception and have some of the wine and cheese, but thank you very much for your attention.
Well, Frank, thank you so much, and this went off without the slightest technical glitch. This worked beautifully. You looked great, high definition, wonderful, and as always, this was a real treat, absolutely fascinating. Great. Well, thanks, Frank. I think we can sign off, Adam, and we'll move on to Kurt Volker. Thanks again, Frank.
All right.
Now, people have been introducing themselves up until now, and Kurt will introduce himself, but I'd just like to welcome him especially because he's a relatively new American interest author, and in fact his invitation here, I was going to say inclusion, but that sounds a little haughty or something. Yeah, that doesn't sound quite right. And I won't tell you anything about the piece that we just published of Kurt's, because presumably he'll refer to it, I hope. And he will introduce himself briefly at length, whatever he chooses. And then after Kurt speaks, we will move on to Walter, Russell Mead, and concluding remarks by Adam Garfinkel. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charles, and thank you for including me. Yes, I'll say a few words about a lot of things, but let me start just a few words of biographical introduction. So, my name is Kurt Volker. I am the executive director of the McCain Institute for International Leadership, which is part of Arizona State University, but based here in D.C. I had a career in the U.S. Foreign Service, dealing with a variety of European political and security issues, from Lockerbie bombing to the Kosovo War, to the war in Bosnia, NATO enlargement. Eventually served several years at the National Security Council at a senior level at the State Department dealing with European affairs, and then was U.S. Ambassador to NATO in 2008 and 2009. And it's been since then that I've left the government, and I've been doing a variety of other things, including establishing the McCain Institute. And I guess because it's an Institute for International Leadership, it's appropriate that that's really the theme of what I wanted to talk about, is the role of leaders. And you'll hear in what I say, and if you read it, you'll see in what I wrote for the American Interest, a lot of echoes of what Frank Fukuyama just said. That is a question of our people feeling that their identities are under threat from a variety of different sources, and that our leaders are not giving them adequate solutions. That's as simple as that. But let me say a few words about what the worries are. People are worried. Immigration is a great example. It's what drove the Brexit vote. Frank just mentioned it in his comments. People feel that it is unfair, that they fear that it is changing the makeup of society in ways that they're not comfortable with. It's therefore challenging identity. It may be taking away jobs. It may be soaking up social services. It may be costing taxpayers who are legal money to subsidize people who are not legal. It's that fear that our people are gripped with. When you really look at the facts, it's not a lot in terms of immigration compared to Europe. Most of these people come and work and pay taxes, so it's different than the perception, but the perception is what's driving. And I think that is true across all of the other issues that I'm going to mention. Whether we see the backlash against Muslims because a number of extremist Islamist terrorists commit terrorist acts and then do it in the name of their version of Islam, and then there's a backlash against Islam. Can't let Muslims into the country, according to Donald Trump, and he's built popular support as a result of that. It goes to a sense that the capital, Washington, has barely felt the recession compared to the rest of the country, which has suffered through a recession. This is a question of elites skimming off the country and not taking care of the people. It gets to the level of national debt. People hear these numbers of mounting national debt deficits. I forget the numbers, but what is it, $32,000 a second or something like that? It's a ridiculous amount of money that just piles up. And people are worried about that. They don't feel it day to day. When you have an economist explain to you how you manage this, it can sound okay. But from a purely human, popular level, people feel like things are out of control, and they feel like our leaders aren't dealing with it. You can go on to the social realm, the pace of social change, challenging perceptions of what had been moral in previous generations, challenging perceptions of common sense, the use and insistence on politically correct speech and the need for safe areas if there are people who speak that you disagree with, and the effect of this on college campuses. It just creates a whole backlash that something is going haywire. That's the scenario. And you could play the same thing out talking about Europe and the rise of populist movements in Europe and far-right movements. I would say there are some far-left movements that profit from this as well. You have Podemos in Spain, you have Syriza in Greece, there are a few others as well, so it's not a uniquely on-the-right phenomenon, but it is a rejection of the establishment and the elites. And this is where I think I have a similar cast, but maybe a little bit sharper tone about this than Frank Fukuyama does, because I actually blame our leaders for not grappling with this situation. I don't blame the voters. I don't blame people who are upset about these things. It's genuine. These are their lives. This is what they feel. I may not agree with it all, but it's legitimate. And they have a concern. What's been happening is elites, and here we can take, for instance, the British elites in the Brexit vote. They've just been telling people what's in their own interest and saying it louder and louder and insisting that if they don't go along with that answer, then it's going to be doomsday. Well, people don't react to that very well. People don't like to be told what's in their own interest. They're going to decide for themselves what they think is in their interest. And it may not be as rational and factually based as the elites in the Tory party or the Labour Party would want it to be. It may be just purely emotional and reactive and a sense of protecting one's identity. And that is why I think that elites, whether it's in Brussels, Berlin, London, Paris, Washington, we haven't had leaders who have genuinely understood, internalized, and communicated with people about their fears and given them solutions that they can have some confidence in. If they just keep getting more of the same, being told that we know better and it's all right, it just accelerates that swing of the pendulum away from the elites. And that's what we've been seeing. So I have a high degree of blame for our own political elites for not dealing with this. What happens in that circumstance? Then you have the rise of the populists with the simple explanations, the nativist answers, the tribal identity, the racist preferences, the religious preferences, the division of people in the groups, circling the wagons around one group or another, which is very divisive, very dangerous for society, will not produce good solutions, but it gives people something to believe in that they can relate to. They can relate to that identity. They can relate to that yearning back for a past when things were more like that and it was more comfortable. Even in the fog of hindsight, people believe that. And politicians, demagogues, populists, they can take advantage of those feelings to position themselves for political gain. That is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on for decades, if not centuries. It's not an American phenomenon uniquely. It's been all over Europe. We saw this many times in the past. We've seen it even in recent years. Let us leave alone Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, leave alone Boris Johnson and the Brexit vote. Go back a decade. You had Marine Le Pen's father running the National Front in France with a very similar message. You had Zhirinovsky in Russia telling the Russian people a similar message to that. You had Jobbik, and before Jobbik in Hungary, you had political parties such as the Justice and Life Party or the Smallholders Party that also had that similar way of telling people there is a way to circle the wagons around ourselves and defend our own nation, our own identity. I was with a European foreign minister for dinner last night, and one of the fascinating things that he said, and think about this, as an EU foreign minister, actually from a left party, when asked, he said, we need to have a stronger EU, but what does a stronger EU mean? A stronger EU is one that is more efficient, that respects national identity, and is more responsive to the people. That is a huge turnaround from what you would have heard from a European foreign minister just 2 years ago about what would make the EU stronger. The idea that national identity needs to be respected as part of what will strengthen the EU is a new idea. I think it's absolutely right as well, but fascinating to hear that. It's not only national identity, it is cultural identity, it is social and traditional values, it is religious values, it is a whole range of things that people are now fearful about, and leaders need to address those head on. I think the alternative to the populist narrative of circling the wagons in a culturally exclusive way is actually to get back to core values about what makes a society healthy and function in ways that define what our own society was based on, what the European Enlightenment produced, what does produce the most prosperous and developed and open societies in the world and does produce long-term peace and stability. It's just that our leaders have been very shy about standing up for those very core values, especially in Europe. When was the last time that when you talk about human rights, the focus was on political rights of speech, of assembly, of choice in terms of spending money, as opposed to talking about minority groups of one kind or another, whether it's racial or gender or religious, who need protection. That's also true, but the emphasis about basic fundamental rights of freedom for all, democracy for all, functioning market economy, equal opportunities, that language about core values in our own societies has not been the language that we've heard, especially in Europe, when you think about the statist bureaucracy that the EU created as a solution for problems instead of some of these core values. And I think it's the only solution to tackling some of the populist answers instead. I think these things do resonate, including with disaffected and disenfranchised elements of the public. You can go speak with people and tell them that, yes, we need to preserve a cultural identity. We need to keep Muslims out. We need to build a wall against immigration. We need to keep Chinese goods out through higher tariffs and all that. Or you can go and give a much different kind of positive message about core values and principles of work ethic, individual freedom, individual rights, limited government. Those things resonate as well. And I think it's a question of leaders being successful in connecting with people emotionally about those as a more efficient and a more long-term successful counter to what would be a populist narrative there instead. I think that in the end, all of these things, both including what I'm saying, are based a little bit on rational argumentation. And one of the disadvantages that we've had is that the leaders that we've had that have been more reasonable and rational are not good at connecting with people emotionally. And as we look at what we've seen in the last year in our own domestic politics, what we've seen happening in Europe now, if you can't connect at an emotional level with what voters are feeling, you're going to get pushed aside. And we need leaders who are able much more effectively to connect with people at an emotional level, but give them realistic solutions instead of popular red meat that's not going to be a solution at all. So I'll pause there, and I'd thank you for inviting me, thank you for including me, and do read the American Interest.
All right. Thank you, Kurt. Your glasses. All right. Now we are. Here is Walter Mead. Walter, like everyone else, you're going to introduce yourself unless you want me to introduce you. But as you know, that's very dangerous. You want me to do it? No. Okay.
Well, I've often been present when somebody said the next speaker needs no introduction. I'm not sure how often I've been around when they say the next speaker gets no introduction. But you live with, you take what you get. All right, well, plutocracy, what about it? I tried to think about the last big plutocratic era we had in America and think about what's similar and what's dissimilar between this time around and the first time we went through a plutocracy. And our first real plutocratic era was sort of between about 1870, 1920 or so, that period, the Gilded Age, and then going a little further in. And it was a period actually a lot like ours, and if you think about it, there's some similarities and differences between these two eras that can actually, I think, help us think about things. But one thing maybe before going into that, it's worth reminding you that one of the reasons that the United States is the United States is because we were originally a failed plutocracy, a plutocracy manquée. That is to say that the founding fathers, and particularly the more affluent ones like Washington and Franklin and all, were infuriated because even though they were quite successful by American colonial standards, they were really nothing in the UK. That is, Franklin would sit there as the lobbyists for the colonies, and people just weren't that interested. There were some colonists at the time who had no trouble, in particular the West India sugar planters, had absolutely no trouble buying all the House of Commons members that they wanted. And for them, the British theory of virtual representation was right. Each interest is weighted in our parliament due to its actual interests in our society. And the trouble was the tobacco planters and the merchants didn't make out the way the sugar planters had done. So it was status envy by the near plutocrats of the actual plutocrats was one of the sort of fires that got the revolution going. However, 100 years after that, 1870s, we had our first real plutocracy, and it was the result of a massive economic transition. Here's one of the similarities, that what drove that wave of plutocracy wasn't that somehow we changed all our laws in 1872 or that our national culture had transformed itself. What happened was that the Industrial Revolution in the national market of the United States kind of changed the rules of the game. And suddenly you could make enormous fortunes. Now, at the same time those rules were changing, you began to see the start of a problem that would get worse and worse over subsequent decades, which was that family farming no longer really worked as well as it used to. In 1870, almost 60% of the American people made their living on farms. And if you ask somebody in 1870, what do you mean by the American middle class? They'd sort of look at you blankly because they weren't using that vocabulary as much. But it would be the single family farmer. And this was a person who was economically independent, who succeeded on the basis of their own work, managing their own property. And for generations, the pattern had been each new generation of American, farmer would have, I think, 7 kids, 9 kids, and there'd be farms for all of them out on the western frontier. The government was giving free stuff to the American people in the form of cheap farming land. But after the Civil War, even as the Homestead Act extended the free land more, farming stopped working as well for most farmers. Why? Well, because farm productivity was going up, and distressingly, that meant the price of agricultural commodities was going down, and it was getting harder and harder for people to make a profit on a farm. Furthermore, the longer the system went on, the more you were farming marginal land, so that you used to get, when you got your cheap frontier farmland, it was in Ohio and Kentucky. Now it's in North Dakota. And North Dakota, for those of you who've been there, is terrific for fracking and for buffalo ranging, but it's not really that good for farming. And you would have droughts, you would have disasters, and farmers started going bust. As farming becomes more productive and family farms begin to decline, today less than 2% of Americans make their living on the land, and yet we got more food than ever. But the old American middle class of the free family farmer, single family farm, gradually sickened and died during this period. And it was less that a few great fortunes appeared, which they certainly did, then the vast American middle class didn't know how to make a living anymore. The old things that used to work didn't work. And people had to migrate into the cities, start working in factories themselves, and there they met a great wave of immigration. Themselves, by the way, also driven into the American labor market in part by being driven off the land in Europe as the situation changed in Europe. So you have 2 waves of labor moving into the labor market. Wages are not going up. People who were used to living as independent farmers in one system are now suddenly struggling factory workers, 7 days a week at 12 hours a shift, making very low wages, and dirty factories being ordered around at the beck and call of bosses. And at the same time, you have these plutocrats getting very rich. So there was a lot of class conflict that came out of that, a lot of political discussion. That America was full at the time of sort of a combination of nostalgia for the good old days and grim dystopian predictions about the imminent future, much like today. So there really are a lot of similarities between this wave of plutocracy and the last one. So there's a big similarity. What about some differences? I've got one that's an encouraging difference between this wave of plutocracy and the last wave, and a couple that are maybe a little less encouraging. The first change, the first difference, and this is, I think, good news, is that the plutocrats today as individuals are not nearly as plutocratic or as powerful as the first wave of plutocrats. What do I mean? Well, if you compare, for example, the net worth of the richest Americans with the budget of the federal government, to take that as a benchmark, J.P. Morgan or John D. Rockefeller used to have, John D. Rockefeller's net worth was greater than the annual budget of the United States at certain points. All right, we don't have anybody like that today. The richest plutocrats today as individuals in comparison to the power of the state are much weaker than they were in those days. For that matter, in the early 20th century, J.P. Morgan was effectively the Federal Reserve Bank. That is, he was the central bank of the United States. And when there was a financial crisis, he made the decisions about who survived and who went under, what the interest rate would be, what the plan would be. And over again in the 1880s and 1890s, you have cases of basically the Treasury Secretary, hat in hand, going to J.P. Morgan and a handful of other bankers asking for their help because the federal government didn't have the ability to direct the money. The federal government didn't control money, really. So the plutocrat, there are no individual plutocrats in the United States today who have anything like that power. Yes, they can bribe politicians. Give them campaign finance contributions. But there you have the Madisonian problem that Frank was referring to. There'll be a lot of people on other sides giving them other campaign contributions. And so if the evil corporate sector that wants the price of oil high so that the oil companies make a lot of money, while all of their plutocrats and financial interests go in and give money on that side, but then all the car industries that make money if the price of oil is low, so the price of gas is low, so we all go out and buy gas-guzzling SUVs that make fat profits for them, they're on the other side. So the masses of plutocrats on either side of this issue have a harder time controlling the situation, and there's nobody who stands head and shoulders above the rest. So that's a little bit of good news. There's a slight downside to it. We have a lot more plutocrats than we used to. Plutocracy is almost becoming a mass phenomenon. I mean, I was talking to somebody I know who's sort of worth, I guess, $200 million or something, and they said wistfully, people like us used to be rich. And in a sense, that's right. That levels of wealth that a couple of generations ago you would have thought were just insanely, just really right up there. And now these people, can't even get tickets to some benefits because they just don't rate. So we have a mass of plutocrats, and that gets us, I think, to a difference that is less encouraging, which I think on the whole is we have the plutocrats we've got now are not as good as the plutocrats that we used to have. We have an inferior crop of plutocrats among us. Let me just say, since this is being filmed, and all the plutocrats I personally know, I don't mean you. I'm talking about other people, okay? You are different. But you look at the sort of, I had the sort of misfortune, I suppose, or odd fortune, to go to a school that was founded to train plutocrats. They obviously didn't teach me the most important lesson of all, which is how to be born right. That whole parent selection thing I never got. So I'm not the child of plutocrats, but I went to school with their kids. And this was a school that was founded actually with J.P. Morgan on the board of trustees, and Teddy Roosevelt was involved, and it was to build character in future generations of plutocrats. And we're talking cold showers in the morning, 10 basin to wash in, the sort of competition. None of the kids could have more than $2 a week pocket money, that sort of thing, where you're separated from your parents' wealth and you have to kind of make it in the this sort of jungle of other teenage boys who are not necessarily very nice to you and aren't necessarily impressed with your last name. They were also sort of given a tremendously focused spiritual education, studying all these Bible things and commandments and religious teaching and social responsibility, all of those things. And so out of that, you get plutocrats like, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Averell Harriman, Dean Acheson, sort of a whole galaxy of these people come out and are actually some of the people who in the middle of the 20th century provide the leadership that the country needed in order to move to a different kind of post-plutocratic or maybe intra-plutocratic age. And they made a major contribution. They had been taught from very young that, yes, you're very wealthy. No, you didn't earn it. Yes, it's a privilege. And with that privilege comes responsibility. And we expect you to live up to that and exercise your responsibility well. I think our plutocrats today tend to be more into discovering themselves and helping their kids, discover their own inner child. We have a, more narcissistic breed, and we don't, there isn't the same kind of cultural capital where our leadership class is really doing the only thing that makes a leadership class tolerable or worthwhile, which is to say, leading. And so we have one of the curses of our plutocratic age is an insufficiently responsible plutocracy. And so maybe it's time to start rounding up their kids and putting them in horrible boarding schools where they'll have to go through absolute misery all during their adolescence, and then maybe that'll ground them a little bit more. So that's a problem. Then there is another, I think, problem that is also a bit discouraging, a difference between our plutocratic age and past ones, and that is that our plutocracy is global, and a lot of that global plutocracy is actually a kleptocracy. One can object to how rich Warren Buffett is, or at least one can wish that one were as rich as Warren Buffett is. One can say, Bill Gates, you're so darn rich, you've lost all touch with real people like me. But they made their money in a reasonably honest way. They developed products, they built businesses, or even they just inherited it from ancestors. But we are now confronting kleptocratic plutocrats who've come from the former Soviet Union, who've come from China, where the amassing of great wealth is almost completely detached from any kind of law of God or man, where it is a scramble for wealth, where the unscrupulous and the smartest, the ones with the sharpest edge, amass tremendous wealth, and then they appear over here among us. And unfortunately, all too often, some of our banks, some of our other institutions are ready to receive that money, domesticate that money, and find ways for that money to get into our own power structures, influence policy, affect the way we deliberate here. So we have, now there was an international class of rich people during this 19th century, and if you don't believe me, go read the novels of Henry James. There's plenty of it. And wealth has always had a tendency to be global. But again, the wealth was a little bit more associated with either the kinds of aristocratic origins or some kind of business origin. You certainly saw a certain amount of looting, say in the Second Empire, a bit of political corruption, but not on the scale of what we've seen in the former Soviet Union, where corruption isn't just a way of doing business, it is business. Those things are more depressing. If we look at these eras, these two eras in plutocracy, I think the most important thing, though, is not the plutocrats in either era. Yes, they matter, they have influence, and whether they're good or bad can make a difference. But what was really important in ending the first age of plutocracy, and what made it a difficult experience for most Americans, wasn't that other people were getting rich, but that the middle class wasn't doing well. People had grown up thinking that to be an independent American in the middle class meant owning a farm and working the farm and living by the result of your own labor. You lose that economic foundation. You find yourself working in a city, in a factory, taking orders from people without the same kind of status or recognition, and your living standard is down. There was a destruction not just of the economic stability and security of the middle class. There was an erosion of its kind of moral and cultural and social foundations. We are seeing that today. Again, what we're seeing is that what's happening in the sort of manufacturing and clerical economy is more or less parallel to what happened the first time around in the agricultural economy. We've gone from about over 30% of the labor force working in manufacturing to about, I think, under 9% of the labor force is now working in manufacturing since the 1970s. We don't keep the same kind of statistics, but all the sort of routine clerical work, I see many people here like me are old enough to remember that in many offices you would see these large typing pools full of clerical workers doing essentially data entry on typewriters. That's all gone. We are seeing an erosion of the kinds of jobs that the average American middle class relied on to make a living, for its self-respect, for holding its own in society. And as that happens, you see an erosion of the sort of, people don't know how to bring up their kids. They're not bringing their kids up as well, perhaps. Their families are falling apart. These things we actually saw in that first era. You read about what people write was going on in the cities, the cities of the early industrial age, of that Gilded Age period, street children, crime, violence, that sort of thing. This is all coming back to us now. Again, I think then as now, ultimately the answer is going to be the same, which is the answer to the problems of plutocracy isn't so much to fix plutocracy as it is to fix the middle class. What is the foundation for the next era of the middle class? We went from single-family farm to single-family home. What comes next? What is the next American middle class? It used to be agricultural, then it was industrial. Where will the bulk of the American people be making their living in the future, and how? This, I think, is fundamentally the question that we have to answer as a society. If we do that, I think what we'll see is the revival of a middle class that is conscious of its own interests politically, that has a sense of the way it wants the country to go, and elites and wealthy people will really, have to work with that system. It's not right now, I think, that the plutocrats are strong. It's that the rest of society is weak. And that's, I would suggest to you, is the condition that we really need to work to remedy. Thank you very much. Our next speaker also gets no introduction.
I get no introduction. But I can introduce myself in one sentence. I am Adam Garfinkel, and I am the editor of the American Interest. I'm the only editor that the magazine has ever had since it was formed about 11 plus years ago. And I have to tell you that when I walked into this venue, of course I saw these two covers up here, but outside you see, leaning against the wall on the other side of the partition, you see a whole lot of other covers, not all the covers by any stretch of the imagination, but blown up posters of a lot of the covers that we've done for many, many years. And, when I see that, first of all, I feel pretty old, because 11 and a half years of putting out this magazine is as wonderful and educational and enlightening to me as it's been. It's been a lot of work. And there are a couple people in the room, staff people, who've been with the magazine from the very beginning. I think I saw Dan Kennelly. Is he still here, Dan? He's probably getting something to eat, but, and Charles, of course, is the publisher who's been behind this very generously from the very start. It's very edifying. And I have to say, we're in Washington here. We go around, we nomad around the think tank world. We eat this, we drink that, we listen to this, we talk to this person. And maybe it's just me, but it seems to me that what we've heard in this program, starting with Tyler this morning and winding around through Jeffrey and Nils and Frank and Walter and Kurt, I don't actually recall hearing a higher quality level of discussion in Washington than what I've heard today. And it's very daunting. My job, given to me by the publisher, was to kind of sum up what had gone before. I think if you've been here all day, you would realize how very difficult it is, because people have been at the subject from all kinds of angles. But it's not. I don't see how I sum it up, because it's not summable. We are dealing here with a series of open-ended problems. There are many pieces to the problems, and I don't know how to sum them up. So I thought what I'd do instead was just make a couple of my own comments. And I don't want to speak for very long on this, because I know that by now everyone's probably ready for a little exercise and some more libation. But I just want to make a few comments about some of the things we've heard today and then some of the things that we haven't heard. There was a scintilla of disagreement, I guess you would say, earlier on in the program this morning about the salience of the nature of and the salience of inequality, and what all that has to do with plutocracy. And it's very hard when you're giving oral presentations to be as precise as you can be in writing. But it seems to me, just for what it's worth, probably not much, it seems to me that, as Frank said from Palo Alto, there's not much disagreement about the inequality of statistics, although I don't trust anybody with numbers anymore from experience. But be that as it may, there's not a lot of disagreement about the numbers. There's some disagreement about what the numbers mean. If you put a sociological filter on some of the numbers, some of the claims made about what they mean erode. They don't disappear, but they erode. But that's not my issue. My question is, what's the inequality data got to do with plutocracy? And here, it seems to me that what the people that I call the Trumpan proletariat, should excuse the expression, the Trumpan proletariat are not confused and angry because of their concerns about inequality. And here I think I agree with Tyler, basically, that most inequality, when people perceive that, is local. I don't think that's it. I don't think people actually know these numbers, unless they are very unusual members of the Trumpan proletariat. As Kurt said, this is an emotional thing. I think what you've got here, and Frank mentioned this, what you've got is an erosion of class status. And the one word I haven't heard today, but which I would have heard if I were in Europe, 70 or 80 years ago, or 170 years ago, is the word déclassé. It's a French word, but it basically means the downward mobility of entire social classes. And what happens when, for whatever reason, you have large numbers of people who feel themselves and who are downwardly mobile relative to other sectors of a society? What happens politically? What are the political implications of that kind of phenomenon? Now, sometimes you'll hear, if you look at the mainstream press, sometimes you'll see references back to Weimar. All right, but you very rarely read anything that goes historically any deeper than that. But the phenomenon of déclassé cycles in Europe goes back much longer than that. And I've been surprised really in the last couple of months at the historical shallowness of the analysis that most of us are able to read in the literature. But so what happens to people when they lose class status? They often become confused and frightened. They often look for scapegoats. They start thinking dualistically, and they depending on what kind of ideas are floating around in the ambient intellectual environment, they often come up with extremely nefarious notions. I mean, the most famous example of a déclassé aristocrat is Joseph de Gobineau, who is the father of modern racism and anti-Semitism. So when people point to the Trump proletariat and their leader, Donald Trump, as neo-fascist, it's not really fascism. It's kind of the wrong word. But it seems to me it's clearly an example of the ruminations of a déclassé epoch and the kinds of opportunistic leaders that can manage to harvest the confusion and the fears and the anger that always happen when there is massive downward motion in a social class. Now, as others have said, in the every place is a little different. In the United States, it's tinged with racial and ethnic and to some extent religious overtones. That's always been part of the American experience. I think that's true. But I don't think any of this has to do with inequality. I mean, I think inequality is a problem. One can argue how much of a problem and in what ways it's a problem. But I don't see a very direct connection between inequality, which is a problem in its own right, and the plutocratic issues, which I think is also a problem, but has a different origin and a different mechanism. And I wanted to mention something about the mechanism. When people talk about, people have been talking about plutocracy, there was a senator from, I think it was South Dakota or North Dakota, Pettigrew, wrote a book called Plutocracy Triumphant. This was at the tail end of the first Gilded Age. I think the book was published in 1921 or 22, something like that. I think he was one of the first senators from the Dakotas because they weren't in the Union before this guy became a senator. So he lists, all this, the egregious sins of the railroad barons and so on and so forth. And he talks about the origins of the Grange movement and the origins of the Interstate Commerce Commission, all the history that I wish people knew and hope that they do and don't always believe that we do anymore. Went through this, that was a very popular book. There were a couple of Southern congressmen who wrote books. They were bestsellers in the 1920s and so forth. So we've been through this before, this welling up before. Walter covered, I think, very, very nicely. But what are the mechanisms and how have they changed? It seemed when I wrote my piece for this issue that's on the wall there, I tried to think through just how exactly money translates into political influence. I tried to create some sort of a kind of a thumbnail typology of how this works. And I came up with basically a quadripartite typology. When I read the piece again recently, I tried to think, could I improve my thinking? If I were writing this piece now 5 years later, given all that's happened, would I do it differently? And the answer is no. Which means either that I had a pretty good run when I wrote it or that I've been stagnating intellectually since I wrote it. I don't know which. But here are the four ways that, the four mechanisms that plutocracy works through, that translates money into political influence. So the first method is affecting legislation and regulatory writing in such a way that all the costs, or as many of the costs as possible, of regulating industry get passed on to the public rather than to the industries being regulated. It's a very popular mechanism. That's a lot of what lobbying does from corporate and financial sector. It offloads the costs of all the transactional costs of regulation from the industries being regulated onto the public wheel. The second is to essentially shape laws and also accounting procedures in such a way as, of course, especially the tax code, but not only the tax code, in such a way that the privileges of money are maintained. So in other words, the nest egg, the reservoir of money that provides the political power can be protected through essentially suborning the political process to create laws that are favorable to the preservation of that money. Now, this doesn't just affect the tax code. There are lots of other ways that laws and reg writing and accountancy rules do this. And I want to refer to an article that I hope all of you have seen, but one never knows, an article by my friend Steve Tellis, which appeared in I think it was the fall 2015 issue of National Affairs. National Affairs, as you know, I can say that at the Hudson, it's considered a conservative magazine. And the editor, Yuval Levin, I think was right and brave to publish this article, which is called The Scourge of Upward Redistribution, in which Professor Tellis shows how through a whole variety of rent-seeking and licensing and barriers to entry kinds of behavior produced by plutocratic penetration of the legal system and the regulatory writing system has basically created upward redistribution in the American economy, where money flows up to people who are not necessarily to the 1%, but that money basically flows up. So we have this very strange kind of deal here where we have a kind of a welfare state, not the same as Europe, but we have a welfare state. We have a redistributionist state. And if you add up the benefits of redistribution and you add up non-monetarized benefits from your employer and things like that, again, the inequality data evens out, not at the top, but more or less in the middle. But the odd thing is that even as we're redistributing resources from the middle down to poorer people, we are redistributing more resources from the middle up to richer people and creating barriers to entry and creating all sorts of rent-seeking niches in the economy that are part now of the systematic structure of the American political economy. The third mechanism of how plutocracy translates money into power is mainly focused on lobbying to make sure that the political process itself is open to the influence of money. The whole campaign finance portfolio is what I'm talking about here, and the way that money from lobbyists have managed to essentially increase the porosity of the political system to the influence of money. Now, of course, the Supreme Court, somebody mentioned Citizens United before. That, of course, is the apex of this. It wasn't that money suborned the Supreme Court. The Roberts Court did this all by itself. And I personally consider Citizens United to be the worst Supreme Court decision since Dred Scott. Got to go back a long way to. But I think it was just a catastrophic decision. And again, the influence of Citizens United, I think, is already manifest in all the soft money pack. You can't identify the sources of all this money flowing in. Maybe Walter's right that the plutocrats really aren't the problem and that it's the weakness of the middle class. Could be, but it's still a problem. And then the fourth mechanism is lobbying to make sure to validate maximum feasible lobbying. All right. There are other democracies, most of the democracies of Europe, where the kind of sway that lobbyists have are simply not allowed. It's against the law to do certain things. But part of plutocratic lobbying is to make sure that they have the right to plutocratic lobby in order to do the other three things I already mentioned. So I tried to work out a typology of how this actually functions in the political system. And it seems to me that if you want to get a handle on limiting or moderating the effects of money on American politics, you've got to understand how these four functions work and intertwine. And if you want to do something about it, that's the way you have to think about it. You think about it in terms of the functionality of how money translates into political power. Otherwise, I just want to. I saw the movie The Big Short pretty recently. I had the book by Michael Lewis. It's been sitting on my shelf for, I don't know, maybe a year. I never quite got around to it, you know. Do you realize, I just want to, just parenthetically, do you realize that the words busy and the words lazy are actually synonyms? Did you know that? There's some people who think they're busy, but they're lazy. There are other people who think they're lazy, but they're actually busy. I don't know what I am. All I know is I didn't get around to reading the book. But anyway, I saw the movie, and I want to make two comments come into my head as a result of having seen this. One is as follows. 2007 is the beginning of the subprime crisis. 2008, 2009 plays out. Why? Well, as Tyler said earlier in his insane perfect storm scenario, which I thought was very entertaining and a little frightening, but still entertaining. He mentioned kind of in passing the China trade stuff. I'd like to mention it right now a little bit less in passing, because there's some fairly arresting data. Again, I don't trust numbers, but there's some fairly arresting data that one can generally speak of. So in 1999, I believe it was, the United States extended most favored nation status to China, and in the year 2000, it was made permanent. As a result of these political deals, in I think it was April 2001, right at the very beginning of the Bush administration, China entered the WTO. Now, look at what happened between 2001, and about a decade later, 2011. You could actually look up the changes in the deficit numbers, the trade deficits. The differences is galactic, but that's not really important. What's important is the derangement of the American labor profile. It was already being somewhat deranged going back to the 70s, but the rapidity of the derangement shows in the fact that between about 2000, 2001, and 2011, the number of manufacturing jobs in the United States was reduced by 31.6%. That's almost a third in less than a decade. That is an enormous shock to the labor profile in the United States. Really an enormous shock. So what happens as a result of this? In 2007, 2008, suddenly, the housing bubble is no longer sustainable. People can't make their payments because they're losing their jobs, because the deterioration of the manufacturing sector, of course, has second and third order knock-on effects in the rest of the economy. We're sort of turning into a little bit of an economic swoon. And, of course, the demand for housing is reduced as a result of this, so the prices are not going up. So you can't like in the movie, there's some stripper out in Las Vegas who owns 5 homes, but they're all adjustable rate mortgages, and she's paying a pittance on these things. She owns 5 homes in a condo, as I recall from the movie. So all of a sudden the arm is going to, the adjustable rate's going to kick in, and all of her payments are going to go up by 200%. So what do you do at that point? Well, you said, well, my agent said, you just refinance. But you can't refinance a mortgage that's going to be underwater. So in order to be able to do that, the price of the house has to keep rising enough in order to get underneath of the cost of the refinance. If it doesn't, if the prices stagnate, you can't refinance and you're screwed. And of course, that's what happened to an awful lot of people. Something like, I think it was 6 million families lost their homes as a result of this, right? So there's a connection between the loss of manufacturing jobs, which you're starting to see really start to bite pretty hard in the economy by 2007, and the onset of the subprime and the housing crisis. There are other factors too, the fraudulence in the security market, all kinds of reasons. But there's a connection, it seems to me, between, why did the housing crisis happen when it happened? It happened in part because people were starting to lose their jobs and they couldn't make their payments, and it cascaded, all right? So it's not just one thing or the other. I think both things were involved. So right on time, you have Occupy Wall Street, which is the prolegomena, so to speak, of the Sanders campaign. And you have the Tea Party right around the same time, which is the prolegomena to the transmogrified lumpen proletariat Trump hostile takeover of the Republican Party. All this is right on time, right on schedule. I mean, to me, it's not the slightest bit mysterious. It tracks along exactly the way you think it would. So I tend to think that, just to summarize, that status insecurity and downward class mobility explains a whole lot more of the anger and the character of our politics right now than inequality or the inequality data. Again, not denying that is a separate and important problem. And I think that there's a connection between the freeing of capital to roam. Capital does not obey Ricardo's law the same way that goods and services do, and it causes lots of trouble. I think there's a connection between the globalization piece on the one hand and and the economic dive and the erosion of confidence that we had experienced back then, and that undermined confidence in the political class that's never recovered. And finally, toward the end of the movie, this is the second riff off the movie. Toward the end of the movie, the actor who plays Mark Baum, I don't know the actors' names. I'm a complete terminal primitive when it comes to Hollywood stuff. I just don't remember any of that stuff. But the actor who plays, very convincingly, who plays Mark Baum, gets up and gives a speech in a kind of a seminar. And there's a guy named Miller who at the time was, I think, the head of Bear Stearns. Bear Stearns had about 3 or 4 days to live at the point where, this scene plays in the movie. And and they swear to God this actually happened. This was not just made up. This actually happened. And Mark Baum gets up and he says that the whole housing market and the securitization market and what the rating agencies were doing, right, that this was all basically fraud. This was fraudulent, okay? But Mark Baum in the movie and in real life doesn't leave it at this, okay? He says, it's not just fraud is going on in the housing market and in the banks and in the economy. It's going on everywhere. I mean, that was around the time that, the doping scandal broke in baseball with all the synthetic stuff. And he going to give examples throughout the culture of how people had simply started doing bad things. Now, I've given this a name. I call this a scoundrel cascade. And what I mean by a scoundrel cascade is as follows. It's essentially a positional competition problem. If you are in an economic niche somewhere in the economy, anywhere in the economy, and people start to do things that are a little bit shady and smarmy, in a tight market, you feel like if you don't do some of the same shady and smarmy things, you'll be put at a competitive disadvantage. So first you've got 1 or 2 people doing things that are sort of below accepted standards. And then from 2 you get 8. And then you get 64. And then you get whatever the next exponential, I'm not really good at math. So you get this cascade of subordinate behavior, on the basis of this competitive, positional competition. And one of our board members, who I wish were here today, Robert Frank at Cornell, a behavioral economist, writes about this stuff in his book called Falling Behind. It's a very interesting book. It seems to me that there are more scoundrel cascades throughout various sectors of our culture today than there were in the past. I'm not trying to idealize the 19th century. It wasn't like Americans were all a bunch of Boy Scouts or anything years ago. There's always been a lot of hoodwinking and snake oil salesmen in this country. The get-rich-quick stuff that Americans have done has been just as much apple pie as the Puritans up in New England. But it just seems to me that basic standards of ethical behavior have, in many parts of the culture, have tanked, and we are seeing more scoundrel cascades now than we used to. So to me, it's not just about the economy, and it's not just about plutocrats, it's about the whole culture. And it seems to me that if you could say that in 2007 and 2008, that you were seeing a development in which the housing market and the banking industry were essentially fraudulent, I think I could make the claim now that what we are seeing with the Trump proletariat and the Clinton Foundation machine is now we are leading into a situation where the entire political system is becoming fraudulent, and it's daunting. So let me end there and just say that the magazine will not stop on this particular portfolio. We're going to keep doing political economy issues. We're going to keep pointing fingers where we can find something to point at. And let me just close by saying we started the magazine, and Frank was integral to this, and so was Walter and others. We decided that the magazine had to be a problem-solving magazine. It couldn't be a school of thought magazine. It couldn't be an ideological magazine. The only thing I ever agreed with Jerry Rubin about was when he said that ideology is a brain disease. Right? The idea was identify a problem, throw away the baggage of the Cold War period, which was just getting in our way and tripping us up, and try to focus on the problem. And we didn't care where intelligent discussion of the problem came from. We didn't care if it came from the left, it came from the right, it came from we don't care, all right? We don't really care about labels and slogans and political button pushing. We care about the problems, their difficulty, and if we can start a conversation about these things, a serious conversation, we've never cared where the authors come from. And that's still the way it is, and it's still the way it's going to be. as long as I am the editor of the magazine. Thank you so much for joining us in this program. Appreciate it.